The Carpathian village lay shrouded in an unnatural silence, the usual howling of wolves replaced by an eerie stillness. A dense fog rolled through the narrow streets, snaking between the dilapidated buildings as if searching for something or someone. The villagers huddled in their homes, muttering prayers in the flickering light of their hearths. They spoke of omens, blood-red moons, whispers in the dark, and the ground trembling beneath their feet. High above the village, perched atop a jagged cliff, loomed Castle Dracula. Its stone walls, blackened by centuries of storms, seemed to absorb the faint moonlight. Inside the castle's cold, silent halls, Count Dracula stirred from his slumber. The ancient vampire, a predator who had long transcended the need for mortal sustenance, felt a disturbance deep within his immortal core. Something was coming, something that threatened the precarious balance he had carefully maintained. Rising from his ornate coffin, he donned his dark cloak and moved silently to the window. His piercing gaze swept over the fog-shrouded landscape. The village below, the forest beyond, and the mountains on the horizon all seemed ordinary. Yet Dracula's instincts screamed otherwise. He sensed it, a force awakening, ancient and powerful, yet unfamiliar. His hand tightened on the windowsill, the stone crumbling under his grip. Miles away, in a ruined chapel at the edge of the forest, a figure stirred. The creature known as Frankenstein's monster awoke with a start, his yellow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His massive frame, stitched together from the remnants of dead men, shuddered as he pulled himself upright. For decades, he had wandered aimlessly, cursed by his existence and hunted by those who feared him. Yet now, he felt a pull, an inexplicable call that resonated in his very bones. He looked around the chapel, its walls covered in ivy and its floor littered with debris. Among the ruins, he found something that made him pause. Strange symbols carved into the stones. They seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the call he felt. Though he could not understand their meaning, he recognized their purpose. These were marks of summoning, left behind by those who sought to commune with forces beyond their understanding. The monster stepped outside, his towering frame casting an imposing shadow in the moonlight. The forest was alive with movement, but it was not the usual rustling of leaves or the distant howls of wolves. No, this was something darker. Shapes moved just beyond his sight, flitting between the trees like phantoms. He turned his gaze toward the mountains, where he felt the pull growing stronger. As he began his trek, the village below erupted in chaos. A young boy, driven by curiosity, had ventured too close to the chapel and seen the monster emerge. His screams echoed through the narrow streets, drawing the attention of the frightened villagers. Armed with torches and crude weapons, they assembled a mob and set off toward the forest, driven by a mix of fear and desperation. Dracula, still watching from his castle, observed the flickering lights of the mob as they made their way toward the source of the disturbance. He frowned. The villagers' crude efforts would amount to nothing, and worse, their actions could provoke whatever force was stirring. He decided to intervene, if only to ensure his own dominion remained unchallenged. Descending from his castle in a cloud of mist, Dracula moved with supernatural speed, arriving at the forest's edge just as the mob reached the chapel. The villagers froze at the sight of him, their terror palpable. Before they could flee, Dracula raised a pale hand. "Return to your homes," he commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. "This is not a matter for mortals." Some obeyed immediately, dropping their torches and retreating. Others, emboldened by fear and ignorance, hesitated. One man, gripping a pitchfork, stepped forward. "And who are you to tell us what we can or cannot do?" the man demanded, his voice trembling. Dracula's eyes glowed red as he stepped closer. "I am the one who keeps you safe from things far worse than me. Leave now, while you still can." The mob scattered, their courage vanishing like the mist in Dracula's wake. Satisfied, the vampire turned his attention toward the chapel and the faint trail leading into the mountains. Further ahead, Frankenstein's monster continued his ascent, unaware of the events unfolding behind him. The symbols grew more frequent, their glow brighter. As he neared the summit, he encountered a ruined monastery, its gates shattered and its courtyard overgrown. In the center stood an altar, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. Before the monster could investigate further, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall and regal, with pale skin and an air of menace, Dracula regarded the creature with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So," Dracula said, his voice smooth and measured, "you are the source of this disturbance." The monster turned, his glowing eyes narrowing. "I am no source. I am drawn here, as you are." Dracula's gaze shifted to the altar. "Then you feel it too, the awakening of something far older than either of us." The monster nodded. "Something dark, something dangerous." Dracula stepped closer, his cloak billowing in the wind. "We are not allies, you and I. But if what you say is true, we may have no choice but to stand together." The monster considered this for a moment before extending a massive hand. "Then let us investigate this threat for now." Dracula hesitated before taking the offered hand. Their alliance, born of necessity, was as fragile as the truce that now held their world in balance. Together, they turned their attention to the altar, unaware of the eyes watching them from the shadows, eyes that belonged to something far more ancient and malevolent. And so, the stage was set. Two creatures, bound by fate, began their descent into darkness, drawn toward a conflict that would test the limits of their strength and their souls. The mountain's summit was a desolate place, its jagged peaks shrouded in mist and shadow. The altar at the ruined monastery stood as a silent sentinel, its glowing symbols pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Dracula and Frankenstein's monster stood before it, their uneasy truce solidified by the shared understanding that something greater than either of them was awakening. Dracula's sharp eyes scanned the altar, his mind calculating and methodical. "These symbols," he murmured, tracing one with a gloved finger, "are not of human origin. They belong to a language older than the written word, a language of power." The monster, standing rigid, observed the vampire with quiet intensity. "Do you understand them?" "Enough to know that we are being summoned," Dracula replied, his voice low and grim. "This is a beacon, a call to beings like us. It is ancient, deliberate, and not to be ignored." The monster's fist clenched at his sides. "And who would summon us? For what purpose?" Before Dracula could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, neither entirely physical nor wholly spectral. The altar's glow intensified, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the ruined monastery. From the edges of the light, shapes began to emerge, indistinct at first, but growing more defined with each passing moment. Creatures unlike anything either had seen took form. They were shadows given substance, humanoid yet amorphous, their movements fluid and unnatural. Their voices, a cacophony of whispers, filled the air with words in a language neither Dracula nor the monster could comprehend. Dracula stepped forward, his crimson eyes narrowing. "Reveal yourselves," he commanded, his voice imbued with the power of centuries. "Who dares to summon us?" The shadows halted, their forms coalescing into a single figure. It stood taller than either of them, its presence radiating an aura of both menace and authority. When it spoke, its voice was a blend of many, resonating with a power that seemed to vibrate the air around it. "You are the remnants of humanity's defiance," the figure said, "the cursed and the created. You were called because the balance of this world hangs by a thread." Dracula's expression remained impassive, but his mind raced. "And who are you to speak of balance? What is it you seek from us?" The figure tilted its head, the movement almost serpentine. "We are the keepers of the void, guardians of the boundary between worlds. The altar you stand before is a gateway, and it has been breached." Frankenstein's monster stepped forward, his deep voice steady. "By whom?" The keeper's form shifted, its edges dissolving and reforming. An ancient entity, older than even the oldest of us. It was imprisoned beyond the veil eons ago, but its prison weakens. Its essence seeps into your world, twisting and corrupting all it touches. Dracula's eyes narrowed. And you wish us to stop it? The keeper regarded them silently for a moment before speaking. You are uniquely suited to this task. The entity's power grows with the fear and suffering of mortals. As beings of both darkness and defiance, you possess the strength to confront it. The monster's brow furrowed. And if we refuse? The keeper's voice grew colder. Then your world will fall, and with it, the fragile piece you cling to. You cannot escape this, for the entity's reach will find you regardless. Dracula's mind turned over the implications. He despised the notion of being a pawn, yet the keeper's words rang true. The entity, whatever it was, represented a threat far greater than anything he had encountered. He glanced at the monster, who met his gaze with equal resolve. I will accept this task, Dracula said, his voice firm. But know this, I serve no master, not even you. The monster nodded. If this is the only way to end the threat, I will stand with you. The keeper extended a shadowy limb, and from the altar rose two objects, a black blade, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols, and a jagged shard of crystal radiating an inner light. The keeper gestured to Dracula and the monster. These are the keys to the entity's defeat, it said. The blade is forged from the void itself, capable of severing the entity's connection to this world. The crystal will contain its essence, binding it once more. Dracula took the blade, its weight both physical and metaphysical. The monster took the crystal, feeling its warmth pulse against his palm. As they did, the keeper's form began to waver. Beware, it said, its voice fading. The entity's influence will manifest in many forms. Trust in your strength, but do not underestimate the darkness within yourselves. With those final words, the keeper dissolved into nothingness, leaving Dracula and the monster alone in the flickering light of the altar. The silence that followed was oppressive, the weight of their task settling heavily on their shoulders. Dracula turned to the monster. We must move quickly. The longer we delay, the stronger the entity becomes. The monster nodded. Then let us begin. They descended the mountain, the glowing blade and crystal their only guides. The forest below had changed. Where once there had been life, now there was decay. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with a foul stench, and the ground squelched beneath their feet. As they moved, the shadows around them came alive. The entity's influence was everywhere, manifesting in grotesque forms that attacked without warning. Dracula's blade cut through them with ease, each strike dispersing the shadows into nothingness. The monster used his immense strength to crush their enemies, his blows resonating like thunder. Yet the closer they came to their destination, the stronger the resistance became. The shadows grew larger, more defined, their attacks more coordinated. Both Dracula and the monster bore the marks of battle, their strength tested with every step. Finally, they reached the heart of the forest, where the entity's influence was strongest. A massive rift had opened in the earth, pulsating with an otherworldly light. From within, a form began to emerge, a creature of unimaginable size and malice, its many eyes burning with hatred. Dracula and the monster exchanged a glance. This was their moment of truth. With the blade and crystal in hand, they prepared to face the darkness head-on, knowing that failure was not an option. And so, the Pact of Shadows was forged, not in words but in action, a fragile alliance against a common foe. Together, they stepped into the abyss, their fates entwined with the fate of the world itself. The rift loomed before them, a gaping wound in reality itself, pulsing with waves of malevolent energy. From its depths, the entity began to take form. Its body was a swirling mass of shadows, its face a grotesque amalgamation of twisting tendrils and glowing, crimson eyes. Each movement it made sent tremors through the ground, its presence suffocating and unrelenting. Dracula gripped the void-forged blade tightly, its weight a reminder of the burden he bore. Beside him, Frankenstein's monster stood resolute, the crystal shard in his massive hand emitting a faint, steady light. Both understood that this was their final chance to act. The entity was moments away from fully manifesting, and its arrival would spell the end of everything. "We strike now," Dracula said, his voice cold and commanding. "Do not hesitate. Its strength lies in corruption and fear. Resist it." The monster nodded, his glowing eyes filled with grim determination. "I will not falter. Let's end this." With a sudden burst of speed, Dracula leapt forward, the blade cutting through the dense air as if it were nothing. He aimed for the entity's core, the swirling darkness that seemed to anchor its form. The entity, sensing the attack, unleashed a wave of energy that rippled outward, threatening to disintegrate everything in its path. The monster reacted instinctively, slamming the crystal shard into the ground. Its light flared, forming a protective barrier that absorbed the shock wave. Dracula used the opening to close the distance, slashing through the tendrils that lashed out to stop him. Each strike of the blade severed the shadows, leaving them writhing and dissipating into nothingness. The entity roared, its voice a cacophony of anguish and rage. It shifted its form, growing larger and more grotesque, its many eyes locking onto Dracula. With a flick of its tendrils, it sent a torrent of shadow spears hurtling toward him. Dracula dodged with inhuman grace, his movements a blur as he countered with precise strikes, each one weakening the entity's grip on the physical world. Meanwhile, the monster advanced, his powerful stride shaking the ground. The crystal shard in his hand pulsed in rhythm with the entity's movements, a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. He swung his massive fist, striking one of the entity's limbs and shattering it into a cloud of shadow. The entity retaliated, wrapping tendrils around him in an attempt to crush him, but the monster's sheer strength allowed him to tear free, roaring his defiance. The battle raged on, each moment more desperate than the last. The entity's power was vast, its form regenerating faster than they could destroy it. Dracula and the monster fought with everything they had, their attacks coordinated and relentless. But even as they landed blow after blow, the entity's core remained intact, its dark essence refusing to be extinguished. "It's feeding on the rift," Dracula shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We must sever its connection to this world." The monster nodded, his gaze shifting to the rift itself. The edges of the rift glowed with the same symbols as the altar, pulsating in time with the entity's movements. It was clear that the rift was both its source of power and its vulnerability. "I'll hold it off," the monster bellowed. "You close the rift." Dracula hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He turned and sprinted toward the rift, the void-forged blade in hand. The entity, realizing his intent, unleashed a feral scream and surged forward, its tendrils stretching to block his path. The monster intercepted it, his massive frame colliding with the entity's bulk. He grappled with the creature, using his immense strength to keep it at bay. The crystal shard in his hand glowed brighter, its light burning the shadows that tried to consume him. "Go!" he roared, his voice a thunderous command. Dracula reached the edge of the rift, the void-forged blade humming with energy. He could feel the pull of the rift, a force that threatened to drag him into the abyss. Ignoring it, he plunged the blade into the ground, its edge slicing through the glowing symbols. The altar trembled, the symbols flickering as the connection between the rift and the entity began to weaken. The entity screamed, its form unraveling as the rift's power was disrupted. It lashed out wildly, its tendrils striking the ground with enough force to send shockwaves through the battlefield. The monster gritted his teeth, enduring the onslaught as he continued to hold the creature back. "Finish it!" the monster shouted, his voice strained but unwavering. Dracula raised the blade high, its edge gleaming with the light of the void. With a single, decisive strike, he brought it down, severing the last of the glowing symbols. The rift shuddered violently, its edges collapsing inward as its connection to the entity was fully severed. The entity let out a final, ear-piercing shriek as its form began to dissolve. The shadows that had given it substance were pulled back into the void, leaving only a faint, echoing presence in the air. The crystal shard in the monster's hand flared one last time, absorbing the remnants of the entity's essence before dimming to a soft glow. Silence fell over the battlefield. The rift was gone, its destructive energy sealed away. Dracula and the monster stood amidst the ruins, their bodies battered but unbroken. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence lifted at last. Dracula turned to the monster, his crimson eyes meeting the creature's glowing gaze. "It is done," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The monster nodded, his massive shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "The world is safe, for now." They stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of what they had achieved sinking in. Despite their differences, they had fought side by side and emerged victorious against a foe that sought to destroy everything. Dracula sheathed a void-forged blade, its surface now dull and lifeless. "This truce was necessary," he said, his tone measured. "But do not mistake it for friendship." The monster smirked faintly, his expression weary but resolute. "I wouldn't dream of it." With that, they turned and began their descent from the mountain, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. The world was safe, but both knew that darkness would always return. When it did, they would be ready, whether as allies or enemies remained to be seen.